Hi, everyone. Welcome to Please Excuse My OCD. My name is Tyler, and today I am joined once again by my friend Erin Jones for a special episode of Please Excuse My OCD. Erin Jones is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. She's a therapist at Bull City Anxiety and OCD Treatment Center based out of Durham, North Carolina, where she specializes in OCD and related disorders. She works with kids, teens, adults, and is very, very focused on mothers with OCD as well, which is something she is very knowledgeable about. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper with her in relation to mothers with OCD for today specifically. So, once again, I always say this at the beginning of all my episodes, but I am not a mental health therapist or professional. So, this should never take place of therapy. If you are struggling, please seek advice from a mental health professional. Erin, how are you?
I am doing well. Excited to be back. How about you?
I'm really well as well. I'm excited to have you back. You're actually the first person to have a second episode, so this is a
Wow.
milestone.
Excited. I felt
Yeah,
like there were so many things that we talked about last time that probably could have been its own episode. So I'm thrilled to be back and uh, hope it helps everybody.
yeah, no, absolutely, and that's the goal, right? So, I think for you, one of the biggest things that I was impressed upon was your knowledge and dedication to mothers with OCD, and if parents, new parents, children, OCD becoming really prevalent in children as well, and how to deal with that. If for anybody who hasn't seen our first episode, I will put the episode in the show notes so that you can kind of get a backstory on her story and really where she specializes in OCD. But I think this would be a really good opportunity to kind of, especially considering that it's Mother's Day, talk through a little bit about in a brief overview as to why OCD kind of comes on for a lot of mothers.
Yeah. First I want to say that we're talking about moms, mothers. It's Mother's Day. I think we'll probably get into this more too, but that OCD can have a like parental or pregnancy or postpartum onset for any parent of any gender identity, even non-birthing parents, so parents who use a surrogate, adopt a child, fathers, etc. But I am a mom, and I think that speaking about moms is really its own kind of special topic. I think within the OCD community because especially moms who do become pregnant and birth a child are often at a higher rate of having an onset of OCD symptoms compared to the general population. So it can happen, especially due to you know, we don't know exactly why hormonal reasons, the stress and changes that take place during the pregnancy and postpartum period. So I think that it's important to know and be more aware that this can happen to again moms, but of course, and anybody who becomes a parent.
Absolutely. And I love that you highlighted the fact that it's not just mothers. This can happen to fathers, this can happen to surrogates, this can happen to really anybody who is involved in really raising a child, bringing a child into this world, as well as helping foster a child's life through adoption too. I'm sure as well.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I think that's important to kind of talk about. I'm so glad that you brought that up. A life change in general can
Yes.
bring about something like OCD. I know that for me, um, death, from a young age, really trying to understand what that was like, and coming from like a mother's perspective, a parent's perspective, life, and for the first time, maybe being met with this kind of realization, like, oh, I now have this human being aside from myself that I love so much already and am responsible for taking care of and fostering and kind of like paving the road. I feel like that can kind of pose such an existential baseline for a new parent to the point where it's overwhelming.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think anyone here who is a parent, or maybe is, yeah, around other parents knows that it's a stressful time anyway. Like you said, it's a big change in life, and yeah, it can make you think about life. And I think it can also lead to a lot of OCD triggers related to death, safety, contamination. Not that the change causes those worries, but that if somebody is already predisposed to OCD, that I think that uh, yeah, like becoming responsible for the life of a fragile child can be pretty scary.
Considering that you and I know what it's like to have OCD, these kind of mechanisms in the way that OCD works with our brain, we understand what that's like. For somebody who's never had OCD or maybe OCD related disorders, that can be pretty shocking. And I think for you, coming at it from a clinician's standpoint, do you see people that kind of come through your office? Do you see more mothers who have never experienced OCD more often than people, mothers and parents who have, OCD or anxiety in the past, come through at a new chapter, having a child? Do you see it more so like full throttle, have had OCD before, or full throttle have never had OCD before?
Yeah, I see both. I think for some people, unfortunately, because this is hard and this is why we're trying to spread awareness, right? Is that when they're pregnant or when they have their baby or a young child, maybe they've had intrusive thoughts before because everybody does, but that's the period of time in which they're really experiencing distressing intrusive thoughts and OCD symptoms. So, when we say like perinatal pregnancy period or postpartum OCD, it's still OCD. That's just the period of time in which the symptoms are taking place. But yeah, I've seen people where maybe they realized after the fact, kind of like I did in adulthood, okay, wait, I've had symptoms of this already. It just what maybe wasn't as impairing in my life, but I noticed it more through these changes in adulthood or when I had a baby. I've I've also seen people who kind of, to go the other way, I guess, who already knew about their OCD, or maybe yeah, they've already had treatment, meds, etc., and it wasn't as troublesome during the pregnancy or postpartum period.
You talked about your story with OCD, kind of like understanding more about it as you became more, involved with other people in their OCD. Are you open to talking about kind of if OCD was present for you, becoming a mother and really navigating that change in your life? Are you open to talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm fortunate that I was growing to understand my OCD a lot more and had more supports when I became a mother. I know that not everybody's in that position. I'm also an OCD therapist, so the supports are all over. But I think that in the pregnancy period and postpartum, there were definitely some times where I was experiencing some more intrusive thoughts, some more urges to check, and I had to just be really mindful and also check in with my partner sometimes about um, just monitoring that and making sure that I wasn't, just continuing to do compulsions and then losing more sleep um, and things like that. There'd be some late at night when I was supposed to be sleeping, looking at things on my phone. Another example is when I had my second child, I had an emergency C-section, and it wasn't necessarily that event that I had intrusive thoughts over, but the scar and the wound on my body. I had a lot of fears about it opening in a very like much more severe way than what could have happened. And I my
Sure.
I would ask my husband, like, okay, let's look at the wound like one time each day, and that's the only time we're going to check it. So there were definitely some things that came up that I think, probably that I'm fortunate that I already knew were uh, becoming more intrusive versus like needed and helpful. I think anyone with OCD, especially who's worked on it, can understand when I'm trying to think of how to put it. Like when you can sense it starting and you can observe it happening, you can see it there, like ready to get in there and get worse. And you have to keep an eye on it. Like, okay, I
Mhm.
know what this is. We're not gonna we're not gonna keep going with that.
The awareness of it is so important because that's the catalyst for change. Without it, it's really
Yeah,
easy to get involved and not decipher the difference between OCD and reality, really.
I think also like the reason why we talk about it more, and there's growing research on it in the pregnancy and postpartum period, but a lot of parents or moms, struggle with OCD on its own or related to fears around the children well after that, 1 year after they've had a baby. I mean, I think a lot of it's still there sometimes for me. Like you said, I have to be aware of it. But there can still be fears about like relationship OCD. Do I love my kids enough? Fear about harm to the child. A lot of moms I work with experience fear of illness and contamination. It also may not have to do directly with the child, but it could be happening more during that period of parenthood.
Totally. And thank you for bringing that up because you brought up a few things actually in that last kind of um, discussion. I wanted to bring up too the wound. You had talked about the wound as an intrusive thought of, oh, like what if something happens or it, graphically becomes um open again, or I'm assuming you probably were like, what if I move a certain way, or all these kind of thoughts that pertain to the wound itself, and that's something I didn't even think about. We talk about motherhood and having OCD as a mother, now having to take care of this child, but also taking care of yourself as a mother. And now you have this massive wound that you have to tend to. I can, one, see how that's alarming and also a very uh, scary thought. But two, how you navigated that with your partner, knowing that this is something you're obsessing over. Okay, we're going to check it just once a day to make sure that it's okay, which I think is pretty um, realistic, and I also think that that's also healthy. Instead of checking it once an hour, twice an hour, kind of thing, as maybe we can do with OCD. But can you kind of like highlight that a little bit more, because I think I had this question on TikTok the other day, and somebody was like, "Hey, how do we know when when we're looking at something from a realistic perspective and checking something
Yeah,
from like a realistic perspective versus like seeking reassurance?" And I think that that's a really important thing to highlight, especially when it comes to your health and checking something like a wound.
absolutely. It's such a hard topic, right? Because I think everything you described in that situation, and with having a wound after a C-section, a major surgery, having a new baby, like the idea of monitoring it, or maybe having some thoughts about, okay, like this wound could, I don't know, become infected or open to some degree or bleed. Like those things could happen. And I think that that's kind of where OCD can try to
Mhm.
sneak in really easily because it says, well, it could, like, this isn't completely catastrophic. But my mind was thinking about all sorts of things happening beyond that even if I didn't move, it was just going to completely like rupture and burst open and very suddenly, or that it didn't look right.
Sure.
And so I think And I will also say that it wasn't like day one coming home that my husband and I had that agreement about checking it. It took a little bit. I had to notice that. But to answer your question, I think fortunately we don't always know in like a black and white way. But I think that it's when it gets hard to accept things at face value, right? So like I knew in my wise mind that if I like what would constitute a medical issue or reasons for me to have to maybe go in and see the doctor sooner. Not everybody can
Mhm.
unfortunately have access to like a postpartum doula or people who can come to the house and look, but um, I think with something like wanting reassurance, for example, am I looking for factual information? Am I willing to like acknowledge the uncertainty that like this is how I'm feeling right now? And yeah, something could happen, but I'll just like generally take care of myself and get help if something happens? Or is that not feeling good enough because you want to keep asking or keep checking? Um,
Mhm.
it just feels like you have to keep doing it. And I think like to wrap that all around, like the difference between wanting factual information and reassurance, no matter what it's about, is that it's like where is it coming from? Like is this question or behavior coming from a place of worry or anxiety
Mhm.
versus, like
I love
factual,
that.
concise information you can get.
Totally, totally. And I like how you map that out a bit, and you also, bringing you back to what you were saying earlier about, it wasn't a black and white situation of knowing like, okay, we're just gonna check it once a day and that's it. This was probably something that took some time to get to for you both, where you
Yeah.
were able to really rationalize like, okay, we're checking this because it's part of what we should be checking, but also at the same time, we know that if I'm going to continue to check the wound that I just checked 15 minutes ago, then I'm not looking for factual evidence that it's okay. I'm trying to satisfy my OCD. So I like that you brought that up.
Yeah. And it is, for the person that acts on TikTok, like it is really hard to tell sometimes. And I
Hmm.
think that, whether it's therapy or monitoring, and sometimes you're looking back a bit after the fact of, okay, I how much time and also mental energy was I spending doing this thing when I was looking
Hmm.
this thing up on my phone or checking this on my body, like calling the doctor's office? Like was it, was I trying to repeat or get an answer that I've either already gotten or I can't get?
Totally. I like that introspection. Do you feel like from you know a mother's perspective versus a clinician's perspective, do you feel that, and this is something I'm genuinely curious about from my stance, do you feel like it's easier to see OCD, right, from the clinician's perspective versus, you're somebody with OCD, as a mother who knows what this is like, who understands what it's like to bring up children, to have children? Do you feel like it's easier to see OCD lurking as a clinician when you're helping someone versus having it yourself, as a mother and dealing with that on a daily basis?
Do you mean does my own experience as a mom like help me see OCD more as a therapist?
Yeah, like do you like when you have somebody who comes to you for help, as a mother with OCD, do you see the pathway, in terms of like what's OCD versus what's not OCD? Do you see that clearer
Mm.
when helping them, versus like living day to day in your own life with OCD as a mother?
Yeah, I think that like being a parent, having children, and I work with kids too, and I worked with kids before I became a parent. So I think as a therapist, you don't necessarily have to have experienced things yet or in the same way as your clients to be able to understand OCD or how it shows up for them, because OCD is OCD. But yeah, I think of course, having been pregnant a couple times and had my own kids, I think there's kind of like having lived experience with OCD in general, like having that lived
Mhm.
experience as a parent does help inform your work.
I think I read somewhere that OCD specialists have the most like, they are the ones with most lived experience in the clinician community. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check that, but I remember reading something along those lines because it's such a heavy, disorder to live with. We're like, we need to help other people who have this, and let them know what this is.
It makes sense. And I mean, yeah, I don't know if the data on it, but I think just in my own experience, and when you're in school, most therapists, you're taught for some valid reasons, I think, to, of course, keep your focus on your client's work. It's not about you. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's very much taught to be a blank slate, like be very, very careful about disclosing things about yourself. And again, that has some clinical and ethical purpose to it. Um, but my point is that, like, I've grown a lot more in my own self disclosure, meaning sharing things about myself, uh, you know, carefully and intentionally in therapy. And my point is that I think, like, of OCD therapists I know versus maybe therapists who aren't working in the OCD community, it seems like the OCD therapists tend to share a lot more self disclosure, and parents. Of course, I think working with other parents, it's so easy it helps so much, I think, for the relationship and understanding to even just say, like, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's it.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's enough information too to just say, yep, I get it.
Yeah. Especially when you're presenting with these horrific thoughts to a professional and you're like, I don't know if they're going to throw me in a cell or if they're going to, put me in a straitjacket. And it's very often not the case with OCD. But when you hear like, oh, like I understand what that's like. I've been down a very similar rabbit hole.
Yeah. And that's especially
You
the
know?
case. I mean, with all OCD, it's so stigmatized, right? I mean, that's why you're here doing this podcast. But I think that,
Yes.
especially for perinatal and postpartum OCD, when somebody's pregnant in the postpartum period, I know we maybe got into this a little bit in part one, but what, there's several issues going on. Like, one, I think a lot of folks who may be pregnant or their partner is, um, could be experiencing symptoms of OCD and not realize it, just like the general public, right? And they don't know. Um, it's not screened properly, meaning that, versus things like postpartum depression, it's not being asked enough. Um,
Mhm.
there aren't surveys being taken or measures being taken in prenatal and postpartum appointments enough to help uh, to help notice or flag that somebody's experiencing OCD during that time. And often, if somebody is having OCD symptoms, again, just like outside of parenting, like in general, but a lot of parents worry about disclosing that they're having intrusive thoughts to their, maybe sometimes their therapist, but also their medical providers, because they don't want it to be misunderstood as, I actually want to hurt my baby or I'm going to,
Totally.
versus I'm having intrusive thoughts about hurting my baby and I'm scared of them.
Mhm.
Because sometimes that is misunderstood, and people fear that social services will be called or they'll be hospitalized when they don't need to be. And and that's not always the case. But I think, by people understanding this more in the general population and the medical field, will help people be able to notice that they have OCD, disclose it, and for medical providers to understand that this is different than psychosis, actual intent to harm and many other things. So it's just so important to understand for everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to kind of wrap that into a nutshell too, you're talking about people who have it or are experiencing it, one being able to open up and translate that to a professional. But in order
Yeah.
for that to be effective, the professional needs to know truly what that is, and to know what the signs are in OCD so that they aren't wrongfully putting them in like a facility or taking the child away. um where's the meeting ground? Like, how can we, either as clinicians, I shouldn't say we because I am not one yet, someday, but from the clinical standpoint, how can clinicians become more aware about OCD, or how can we facilitate, even like you said earlier, having more of a screening process that looks for something like that, so that the people who are experiencing things like that feel safe enough to talk about it?
Yeah, I would say for people who are thinking about disclosing about OCD to a therapist or a medical provider, it could be helpful to ask your provider if they're familiar with OCD, if they have training in it, and if they use, especially if it's a therapist, if they used evidence based practices to work on OCD, like exposure and response prevention, ERP. Usually, those are some pretty good
Hmm.
green flags that you know you're they're going to have some understanding. I think for others, if you're looking up providers, you want to look through the International OCD Foundation, iocdf.org. They do have a provider directory, groups. But I think for the professionals, also going through IOCDF for trainings and some through PSI, Postpartum Support International. I think both of those organizations are, growing information about perinatal and postpartum OCD to help providers be able to access screenings and at least have some understanding of OCD versus things like postpartum depression or psychosis, so that even if they're not sure, they're not immediately making an assumption that could be false. Maybe more of, okay, this light bulb's going off, so I need to have this person get assessed through an OCD specialist so I can know.
Totally. I love that, and I'll put those links in the show notes as well, so that people can, if they are clinicians, look into that more. I did have something that I wanted to touch upon earlier that you brought up. This is an episode for Mother's Day. We're talking about mothers, parents, anybody who's part of the village to, help raise children. What about mothers and parents, fathers who don't have OCD but think their child might, and you had talked about working with children as something that you're very experienced in. How do you manage, as a parent who may not understand what OCD is? How do you manage the anxiety or shame or guilt or any of these emotions that a child may be experiencing with intrusive thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, if you suspect that your child may have OCD, I think even especially if you do have OCD, I mean, we're talking about a lot of the difficult, scary things that could come up in parenthood with the parent experiencing OCD. Um, I always advocate that, of course, you'll make your own choice, like based on your thoughts about genetics and what you want to do as a parent. But having OCD doesn't disqualify you from doing anything, including being a parent. So I just want people to know that too. But I think to answer your
Absolutely.
question, if whether someone has OCD or not, and they suspect that their child does or is starting to develop symptoms, one of the best things that you can do first is work on educating yourself, because it is hard to understand. I mean, you can't completely understand it from an outside perspective, but you can go through resources like I mentioned, IOCDF. They have a huge resource list of books, and they all include either people with lived experience or evidence based people who use evidence based practices. There are plenty of books for parents on understanding and managing OCD in childhood and adolescence in the teen years. So again, first educating yourself, but also through the child, being curious and asking them questions about how they're feeling, or maybe um, being curious about a certain behavior, or if something's like taking them a really long time more than it used to, without being critical and not saying like, you shouldn't be worried about that. I think we're like squashing that now, right? That doesn't work. So
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
definitely like thrown a "don't worry about it" once or twice to my almost 5-year-old, and then I'm like, wait, no. I think we have that reflex sometimes, but don't be critical of their worries, and try to be curious and listen. And then again, same thing if it's like these symptoms are starting to grow, meaning they're interfering in your kid's life. Maybe they're developing some more physical symptoms that could be anxiety too, or OCD, because that's often how it shows up in kids. Stomach aches,
Mhm.
headaches, trouble eating that's not explained by a medical issue. All those things, like it doesn't hurt to check with their doctor, or um, use that IOCDF directory to find a child or teen therapist who can help you assess your
That's
child.
very helpful.
If you have OCD, and because again we're talking about moms, and
Mhm.
a lot of parents experience a lot of guilt, especially if they have OCD and their child does. um, I want to say that, like, you didn't make your child have OCD. First of all, it's not really possible. But second, if your child's struggling with OCD and you experience it yourself, you're going to be the best person to be able to understand them and help them. And that's really important to remember too.
I really love that you brought that up because, OCD is not considered an anxiety disorder anymore. There are, the anxiety is a very big part of it, but shame and guilt are very, very strong factors, components of
Yes.
OCD. And as a parent, like you said, having that guilt of I gave my child OCD or I've passed this on, that kind of thing. I'm not going to lie, it's something that even me as a 31-year-old who's maybe thinking about having children down the road, not sure, but I think about that. Like there is I think, what is it, 20% chance that you could kind of pass it on to your child. I think about that in terms of like, how would I handle that? Would I be able to handle it as gracefully as I think that I would, considering that I've, had it my whole life? The whole thing about like the guilt aspect of it, I think is very important. And that's something that I really love that you highlighted is, it's not that you passed it on to it's not that you gave it to your child, but the fact of the matter is that shouldn't, or not even shouldn't, like just because you have OCD, it is not a reason not to be a parent. You are just as capable as being a great parent as anybody else. If not, you're more equipped to help your child, deal with OCD than anybody else who's never experienced OCD. So I really appreciate you bringing that up for many people.
Yeah. Like you said,
Um,
it's in some people's families, even if their parents or ancestors didn't have it that we know of. I'm not sure about that percentage, but really yes, there likely could be genetic tendencies, but it's still not a guarantee. And we don't know um, yet, because studies haven't been able to be replicated reliably yet, of being able to say like this is the gene that causes OCD. That hasn't been um, determined yet, at least reliably. We
mhm,
know, of course, it can run in families, but back to uncertainty, right? We don't
mhm.
know if we wouldn't know if your kid's going to have OCD or not.
Can can you go into a little bit more detail as to parents struggling with guilt and shame with one, not only their intrusive thoughts and things that they may be experiencing for the first time, but also the thoughts and feelings about maybe having OCD and the possibility of their child having OCD. Can you kind of like walk through that process of how they could be helped?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you said earlier, guilt and shame are they're human feelings, but as humans, we have to have all sorts of feelings, right? But I think for people with OCD, and then especially parents, those are two populations that due to the places that they're in life, can experience in heightened ways. Again, even if you have OCD and you're not a parent, we know that can come with a lot of guilt and shame. We can attribute a lot of meaning to our intrusive thoughts, right? Like, what does this mean about me as a person? You have OCD and you're a parent, or especially a mom. I think if you like were pregnant and birthed the child, I think that those two things can combine and can be a pretty difficult, like, special population, right? Of not
Hmm.
only like I have OCD, but what does this mean about me? What does this mean about me as a parent? Etc. So I think that one, remembering again that your child having OCD doesn't um, you're still their parent and you can know them best and support them best, but to work with the guilt and shame internally, I would recommend working on self-compassion. I think that's an area that can be really really difficult. I don't think it comes with, for me it doesn't, but it doesn't come inherently to many of us. I don't think a lot of us were really taught to use it. I think, in fact, it's been quite the opposite that you're supposed to be
Hmm.
really harsh on yourself and be down on yourself a lot. But when I'm working with a lot of parents, I infuse a lot of self compassion practice with exposure therapy for OCD. I think it pairs really well. It's kind of like you have to find your own language with it, right? So that it like feels genuine and real, but like you're acknowledging that things are hard, you're being there for yourself, you're remembering that you're a human. So I think that working on self compassion is a really great way to help move through those difficult feelings.
I love that. And I appreciate you bringing up the aspect of acknowledgement because, as you said earlier, I mirror that sentiment of we're not taught inherently how to have self-compassion. And so I remember hearing the word self-compassion, the phrase self-compassion a lot, and really trying to understand, like, okay, what is self-compassion? Like, how do I feel it if I don't believe it? How do I, um, feel self-compassion when all I want to do is kind of like, be harsh on myself and change the scenario. And so
Right.
bringing that up, right? Like having that dialogue, even that internal dialogue of acknowledging, like, okay, like I feel this way about this particular situation. I feel shame surrounding this. Um, that kind of, thought process. Do you think that after kind of just acknowledging that you're feeling a certain way, um, what do you do after that? So what, like, after you acknowledge the feeling, you acknowledge the kind of like elephant in the room of like what's going on. Um, what do you do after that? Do you like just go back to what you were doing? Do you try to change some sort of behavior? How does that mechanism work?
Yeah. So before I explain, first, I'll say that if anybody wants to look into this stuff more, I would look up Kristen Neff, Neff. She's like the self compassion guru, self-compassion.org. A lot of this stuff is on there. In the
I'll
OCD
put that in the show
community,
notes.
yes. And in the OCD community, a person who really does a lot of this is Kim Quinlan. Her podcast is Your Anxiety Toolkit. She's amazing. So there's a lot of self compassion stuff in her work. Um, but essentially, yeah, you want to be mindful first of how you're feeling, which takes some practice. You want to acknowledge that you're having human moment in whatever way you phrase that, whether it's, okay, this happens sometimes, or yeah, tough parenting or OCD times happen. And, maybe I'm not alone, etc. And then, yes, you want to work on having some language that's, more loving and kind towards yourself. So usually we're hearing that third part, not the first two, right? It's just like, you
Hmm.
should be nicer to yourself, or people attribute it to just being like super positive, and that's not really what we're trying to do here. Again, like you said, we're trying to be aware that we're experiencing guilt, shame slash having a tough like human moment, remembering you're not
Hmm.
alone. And developing the loving kindness language can take some time. I think there are some exercises online or through the resources I mentioned, or maybe in therapy, where again, like kind of like you said, it can feel like, I don't know, almost like phony or something until you figure out your language for it.
Hmm.
But it's going to be something like, okay, I can be patient, or I can handle these hard things. I've got this, and um, I can get through this. So it's a little different than self reassurance. It's kind of just like, how are you kind of coaching yourself through this moment as if you were speaking to a friend, or for parents, how would you speak about this as if it were your child?
Language is something that you said quite a few times, recently, and I think that we underestimate how important language is to how we navigate our lives, because it's so easy for us to go down the rabbit hole of I should, I shouldn't, why did I do that? I
Yeah.
can't believe that, like things like that. And it's so easy for us to believe those phrases. It's so easy for us to use those words, subconsciously, right off the bat when something goes wrong. And essentially what you're saying is, by changing the language towards ourselves, by changing the language and practicing that intently, is really how we can change how we feel about ourselves later. It is a process of kind of practice and awareness, rather than if I just say it, I'll believe it sort of thing.
Right. And yeah, it's not even necessarily changing your beliefs, but really just how you're coaching or conversing with yourself as you go through life, whether you're having a good time or a really tough time. It's still important the way you're speaking to yourself. And we've talked about folks who have kids, and I think if kids, of course, can be a huge value in someone's life. And I think if you're wanting to work on, like navigating your own guilt and shame as a parent, or around others in your life, for people who don't have kids, like think about how your loved ones, again, especially children, are hearing you speak about yourself. Again, not in a pressuring way, but it's, do we want them to develop that language? Do we want them to hear that constant like self-critical language about like how much you suck as a parent because you made a human mistake? Or do we want them to hear you having a human moment and coaching yourself through it?
That is very real, because there's also an incentive outside of yourself too, um, which is how are we setting the example, setting the road in front of our child here? What is our child hearing? Because what our child hears is essentially going to be what they end up kind of reciprocating later towards themselves. So I wanted to touch upon this on this episode as well, because it's something that I actually have sent this link out to a few people. You are part of the mother moms with OCD support group.
Yeah, so I run a self-compassion group through North and South Carolina for the practice I work at for moms with OCD. That is a, paid group that I run, but I think you're also referencing the IOCDF SIG special
Mhm.
interest group. There's a lot of acronyms in there. The
Oh,
International OCD Foundation has a couple of special interest groups, which are just, yeah,
mhm.
groups of people with a shared interest. So, the one you're referring to is Moms with OCD. It's again a SIG, special interest group of the International OCD Foundation, and
Mhm.
we meet once a month to um, talk about shared experience and shared passions, but also ways to work on, whether through the OCD conference or we've been doing these monthly online called Coffee Talk with Moms with OCD, where people can hop on Zoom and listen to our stories. So a lot of ways to gather virtually and connect with other moms with OCD. And this can be for therapists who share that passion, but also for moms, even more so for moms with lived experience, regardless of whether or not you practice therapy. But we also work on advocating in ways that we can help medical professionals and other therapists learn more about OCD for moms and parents.
That's so important. We tend to look at the world sometimes in black and white, and especially here, in the OCD community, we talk about evidence-based practice, ERP being at the forefront of how we treat OCD from a practical standpoint, clinical standpoint. But I also look at this kind of too as like a little like golden nugget too, which is when you have a community of people who understand what you're talking about, people you can lean on, share stories with, understand their stories. There's got to be some sort of healing factor in something like that as well, because I know I mean, not even as a parent, because I'm not one. I'm a cat parent, that's about it. But as a person with OCD, I can tell you that I would have benefited greatly just knowing that there were other kids like me who were dealing with thoughts like this um, on a regular
Yeah.
basis. So, I try to send that link out to people who I think might benefit from it, specifically as like an extra golden nugget. Like, yes, we have medication, yes, we have evidence-based practice, but it's kind of an extra thing that you can kind of help foster, in yourself for your recovery, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just being able to, like you said, being able to talk to other moms with OCD, or again, if you're not a parent, you want to connect with other people with OCD, that International OCD Foundation directory has a list of support groups, many of which are free and virtual throughout the US and I think other parts of the world too. It takes some
Mhm.
time to find that community, but um, there's many of us out there. So I think, being able to connect with other people who get it is so huge.
I just add one more question for you, from your perspective, because this has been so valuable, and I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing more of your time to talk more in depth about this. What from like a partner's perspective, whether it's the partner with OCD or the partner who doesn't have OCD, if you see your partner struggling, what should you do?
Yeah, great question, because I think often parents or partners, loved ones, like they may see it before before people do who are struggling, right? I think especially for a new parent, you're just like in it, going through it. You may not know. Similarly to what I said earlier about parents, I think one educating yourself, looking through the resources we've mentioned. You don't have to become a full expert on OCD, but start looking into some resources, qualified therapists, and again, in a curious, loving, it's always hard to do, but a calm way, ask your partner some questions about how they've been feeling. I think it's okay to say, "Hey, I actually learned some information about this thing called OCD. Let's talk about it." And I think it's hard when somebody is not hearing you or resistant to doing therapy. But I think that through sharing resources, we can help people understand, get some help. If it's somebody who's um, a parent, maybe connecting with their therapist or their medical provider, um, if you trust them. I'll also say, again, going back to the IOCDF directory, um, our group has one too, bullcityanxiety.com. So some groups like us have free monthly virtual support groups for partners and loved ones of those with OCD, which again, we do have once a month, and it's open to people outside of our state too. But I mentioned that just because one, it's free, and two, getting your own getting your own support from other partners and loved ones who understand it can be incredibly helpful as well.
All of that has been extremely helpful. I'll put all of those links in the show notes for people to find, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, um, just so that people can be aware that they're there, and of course, to connect with you as well. Um,
Yes.
here on I and where can people find you specifically?
I am on bullcityanxiety.com. I do have a mental health therapist Instagram page that I use. It's Erin, Erin, Erin Talks OCD.
Love it. Thank you so much, Aaron. Is there anything that you'd like to leave here on the pod uh, here before we go?
Thank you for having me again for second time guest. I'm honored. I hope it was helpful to everybody. If you have lingering questions, you're not sure if this applies to you, please check out the resources we mentioned or reach out to me. And again, know that you're not alone. And happy Mother's Day to the
Amazing.
moms out there.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This was incredible.
Thank you.